What is going on? She's just deleted her Twitter. She's getting called out because it was exposed, because an interview got I'm not joking when I say this. Something's gone weirdly wrong. Like, we literally hired a freaking Chronically Online GM.
What you just witnessed wasn't just a social media meltdown. That was the sound of a corporate identity crisis exploding in real time. I'm Jax Riley, and I've been following the digital breadcrumbs of this institutional war for months, and what I've uncovered exposes the fundamental split, tearing the Indiana Fever apart from the inside. Kelly Krauskopf didn't just delete her Twitter because of fan backlash. She retreated because her Apple comment accidentally revealed the civil war brewing inside her own organization, corporate suits trying to control a phenomenon they fundamentally misunderstand, versus the Caitlin Clark empire that's already won the hearts, minds, and wallets of the fan base. But before we dive into the smoking gun evidence of how the Apple disaster exposed this institutional identity crisis, hit that subscribe button if you want the insider perspective the other channels won't give you. Because what happened to Krauskopf isn't just one executive's mistake, it's a case study in organizational self-destruction. Here's your roadmap for the next 20 minutes. First, I'm going to break down exactly how the Apple metaphor exposed the corporate mindset that sees Clark as a component instead of the core product. Then, we'll examine the internal warfare between institutional control and fan-driven empire building. And finally, I'll reveal why this identity crisis is about to tear apart every WNBA organization that doesn't pick a side. Let's start with the comment that accidentally exposed everything. October 8, 2024, Kelly Krauskopf introductory press conference. She's trying to sound visionary, talking about building the Fever into an enduring brand.
That we want to sustain the growth and the interest level in the franchise. I mean, this is about the Indiana Fever. Yes, we have a foundational player in Caitlin Clark and Leah Boston, and we're going to continue to add to that. But I want this team to be the leader in the country, and a brand, an enduring brand, like Apple or something. I mean, we have a real opportunity.
Did you catch that? We have a foundational player in Caitlin Clark. Foundational, not transformational, not revolutionary. Foundation, like she's a building block in some corporate structure instead of the entire reason anyone cares about the Indiana Fever. But here's where it gets revealing. The Apple comparison isn't random corporate speak. It exposes exactly how the Fever front office sees themselves versus how reality actually works. In their minds, they're Apple, the visionary company building an enduring brand. Clark is just the iPhone, a product they created and control, except that's completely backward. Caitlin Clark isn't the iPhone in this metaphor. She's Steve Jobs. She's the visionary, the innovator, the irreplaceable genius that makes everything else possible. The Fever organization, they're the corporate suits trying to take credit for lightning in a bottle. The temperature of the online conversation exploded when fans recognized this fundamental misunderstanding. They didn't just disagree with Krauskopf's comment, they saw through to the institutional arrogance underneath it. But here's what the other channels missed completely. This wasn't just about one tone-deaf comment. The Apple disaster revealed a systematic organizational identity crisis that's been brewing since the moment they drafted Clark. I've been filtering through the noise, and the signals point to something much deeper than executive miscommunication. This is about two completely incompatible visions for what the Indiana Fever should be, and they can't coexist much longer. On one side, you have the corporate control faction. They want to build a brand like Apple. Controlled, predictable, institutionally managed. They see Clark as their most valuable asset, but still just an asset to be managed and leveraged for organizational goals. On the other side, you have what I'm calling the Clark Empire. Fans, players like Sophie Cunningham, and anyone who recognizes that Caitlin Clark isn't part of the Fever brand. She is the brand, The organization exists to support her success, not the other way around. And Krauskopf's Apple comment accidentally revealed which side the front office chose. They chose corporate control over Clark empire building, and the backlash was swift, coordinated, and devastating.
And I will say it again. Stephanie White, Amber Cox, Kelly Krauskopf, the Indiana Fever president, they were not ready. Now, Christine Brennan in her book confirmed the WNBA and the Indiana Fever did not realize what they were about to get themselves into with drafting Caitlin Clark, because the popularity they weren't prepared for and didn't see coming. Stephanie White, every single solitary move that you make is going to be scrutinized. Welcome to it. Right here.
That book citation proves what I've been saying. The organizational unpreparedness wasn't just about popularity or ticket sales. They weren't prepared for the psychological and institutional transformation that comes with managing a generational talent. When Christine Brennan documented that the WNBA and Indiana Fever did not realize what they were about to get themselves into, she was describing exactly this identity crisis. They thought they were drafting a player. Instead, they inherited a revolution. But instead of adapting their organizational structure to support that revolution, they tried to fit the revolution into their existing corporate framework. That's like trying to manage Steve Jobs with traditional corporate hierarchy. It's doomed to fail spectacularly. The Apple comparison exposes the fundamental disconnect. Apple succeeded because they built their entire organization around supporting and amplifying their visionaries' genius. The Fever is trying to do the opposite, manage and contain their visionary within traditional organizational limits. Now let's talk about the internal warfare this creates. Because the Apple disaster didn't happen in isolation, it exposed fractures that have been building since Clark arrived, and Sophie Cunningham's recent actions prove those fractures are becoming open rebellion.
You're on the Las Vegas Strip. What can the Las Vegas expect from Sophie?
Oh, you know what? I'm just gonna be me. I don't go in there trying to predetermine anything. I'm dialed in. I need to focus on hitting my shots, making sure I'm executing the schemes right. I'm not focused on the extracurricular activities. And you know what? During that, it was just part of the game. I think the refs had a lot to do with that. It was a build-up for a couple of years now of them just not protecting, the star player of the WNBA. And so at the end of the day, I'm going to protect my teammates. That's what I do. And I'm a team player, so.
Listen to what Sophie's really saying here. I'm going to protect my teammates. That's not just about on-court defense. That's institutional protection against an organization that she believes isn't adequately supporting its star player. Sophie Cunningham has positioned herself as the bridge between the institutional players and the Clark empire. She's willing to take fines, risk suspensions, and publicly criticize league officials because she understands something the front office doesn't. Her value comes from Clark's success, not organizational approval. The build-up for a couple of years pattern she mentioned, that's systematic organizational failure to protect their most valuable asset, and Sophie's protection strategy exposes the institutional identity crisis perfectly. In a healthy organization, the front office protects the star player through official channels, media statements, and league advocacy. In the Fever's dysfunctional structure, a teammate has to risk fines and suspensions to provide protection the organization won't. That's not just bad management, it's evidence of fundamental institutional breakdown, where players are forced to choose between organizational loyalty and empire building. But here's where it gets deeper. Sophie's podcast isn't just entertainment or player empowerment, it's intelligence gathering and narrative control for the Clark empire side of this institutional war.
It wasn't a dirty play. It was an intentional foul, and it was meant to send a message. It turned into a scuffle, and I don't think anybody wanted that. But the way that the game went and how egregious the referees were and how they were not protecting players, and they especially weren't protecting the #1 player in this league, the biggest draw in this league, which is Caitlin Clark, and they continue to not do that. To me, this was not a dirty play. This was making a statement because the referees didn't do their damn job. This would not have happened at the end of the game if the referees did their job during the first play. If the referees did their job, I'm sorry, not just the first play, every single play leading up to that. If the referees had control of the game, that is their only job. The referees' first job, their number one job, is to protect.
That systematic breakdown of referee failure, that's not just player frustration, that's strategic messaging designed to pressure the organization into taking stronger protective action for Clark. Sophie understands that public pressure can force institutional change when internal advocacy fails. She's building audience loyalty that translates directly into organizational pressure, because the front office has to care about fan reaction even when they ignore player concern. The WNBA's fine pattern against Sophie, over $2,000 in 2025, actually proves the empire-building strategy is working. Each fine increases her market value, audience loyalty, and influence within the protective narrative ecosystem surrounding Clark. The martyrdom economics model Sophie's creating exposes another layer of the institutional identity crisis. The league punishes her for empire building, but the punishment increases her empire value exponentially. Her jersey sold out within 48 hours of defending Clark, generating an estimated $2 million in brand value despite the fines. The fine-to-value ratio creates what I'm calling competitive institutional pressure. Every league punishment proves the empire is more valuable than organizational approval. This puts the Fever front office in an impossible position. Supporting Sophie's protective actions means admitting their own institutional failure. Opposing her means fighting against their most popular player's most effective defender. The Apple disaster crystallized this impossible position perfectly. Krauskopf tried to position the organization as the brand builder, but the fan reaction proved that Clark's empire doesn't need institutional permission to generate loyalty, revenue, and influence. Now let's examine how this identity crisis is playing out in the broader competitive landscape, because what happened to the Fever is about to become a case study for every other WNBA organization. The old model of team management assumed institutional control over player narratives, fan relationships, and brand development. Teams built brands, players contributed to those brands, and fans consumed team-controlled content and messaging. The Clark Empire model flips that completely. The player is the brand. Fans build direct relationships with player success, and institutions exist to support and amplify player empire building rather than control it. Most WNBA organizations are still operating under the old model, which creates the same identity crisis the Fever is experiencing. They're trying to manage empire builders with traditional corporate hierarchy, and it's generating institutional dysfunction across the league. Official sources won't tell you this, but if you follow the digital breadcrumbs, a different picture emerges of how Clark's success is forcing organizational adaptation across the entire Teams are being forced to choose between traditional institutional control and empire-building support structures. The successful ones will adapt their organizations to amplify their star players' empire potential. The unsuccessful ones will keep trying to fit empires into corporate framework. The Fever's Apple disaster proves what happens when you choose wrong. Krauskopf's retreat from social media isn't just personal embarrassment, it's institutional surrender to empire pressure that the organization couldn't contain or control. But the story doesn't end there. The identity crisis exposed by the Apple comment is creating ripple effects that extend far beyond one executive's Twitter deletion.
The WNBA is doing with Caitlin Clark is the equivalent of the NBA doing this to Michael Jordan in 1986. It just doesn't make sense to me. You are biting the hand that feeds you. Mind you, without Caitlin Clark,
that Jordan comparison elevates this identity crisis to historical significance. The NBA learned to build their entire institutional structure around supporting and amplifying Michael Jordan's empire potential. The WNBA is still trying to fit their Jordan into traditional organizational boxes. The treatment comparison exposes the fundamental institutional identity crisis. Are WNBA teams going to be empire builders or empire controllers? Because after what happened to Kelly Krauskopf, the choice is becoming unavoidable. Organizations that choose empire building will adapt their structures to amplify star players' success, support protective narratives, and build fan relationships around player empire. Organizations that choose empire control will keep experiencing the same institutional failures the Fever just demonstrated. The influence network analysis I've been conducting reveals cross-platform coordination between Clark Empire supporters that operates independently of institutional approval or control. Fan networks, player advocates like Sophie Cunningham, and content creators are building empire infrastructure that doesn't need organizational permission to generate loyalty, revenue, or influence. That independent infrastructure is what made Krauskopf's retreat inevitable. When your Apple comment contradicts the empire that actually generates fan loyalty, the empire wins every time. The competitive intelligence summary is clear. While other channels focus on individual controversies, they're missing the institutional revolution where star player empires are becoming more powerful than traditional organizational authority. The real story isn't Kelly Krauskopf's Twitter deletion, it's the emergence of empire-building models that can override institutional control through fan loyalty, player advocacy, and economic leverage. But here's where this gets interesting for every other WNBA. The Fever's Apple disaster just provided the blueprint for how not to manage empire builders, and the lessons are being studied very carefully across the league. Teams with star players are watching the Clark Empire model and asking themselves hard questions. Do we build our organization around supporting our stars' empire potential, or do we try to control that empire within traditional institutional frameworks? The organizations that choose empire building will implement support structures, protective advocacy, and fan relationship models that amplify star player success. The organizations that choose empire control will experience escalating conflicts between institutional authority and empire loyalty. Based on the escalating patterns I've been tracking, the Fever's institutional identity crisis is approaching a breaking point. The Apple disaster exposed organizational dysfunction that can't be resolved with better PR or executive training. Either the Fever adapts their institutional structure to support Clark Empire building, or they'll face continued conflicts between corporate control and empire loyalty that make organizational success impossible. The fan network economic leverage is already escalating. Organized economic warfare now includes explicit threats where 75% of Fever fans state they'll follow Clark wherever she goes, stopping their Fever support the moment she leaves Indianapolis. That represents direct economic pressure that can impact team revenue, sponsor relationships, and organizational viability faster than any corporate restructuring process. The broader implications extend across professional sport. This represents the first documented case of star player empire building overriding traditional organizational control through fan loyalty, player advocacy, and economic leverage. Other leagues are watching this development very carefully, because their teams could face the same identity crisis the moment they draft or sign an empire builder who generates independent fan loyalty. The question for every sports organization is simple: are you going to build empires or control them? Because after the Fever's Apple disaster, the middle ground is disappearing fast. Okay, now let's get into rumor territory. Nothing is officially confirmed, but the online chatter is too loud to ignore about what's really happening inside the Fever organization since the Apple disaster. The temperature of the internal conversation suggests the identity crisis has moved beyond public embarrassment into active organizational restructuring discussions. Sources close to the team are calling the current situation unsustainable for long-term success. Reddit communities and insider networks are documenting what they're calling different islands within the organization: corporate control advocates versus empire-building supporters, with very little communication or coordination between factions. The institutional loyalty split is reportedly affecting everything from roster decisions to marketing strategies, with different organizational levels supporting incompatible visions for the team's future direction. I've been connecting the dots between the Apple disaster, Sophie's protective advocacy, fan network pressure, and organizational retreat patterns, and the signals point to something approaching institutional crisis. The Krauskopf Twitter deletion was just the most visible symptom of deeper organizational dysfunction that can't be resolved without choosing sides in the empire versus control battle. But here's what happens next. and why this matters for every WNBA. The institutional identity crisis exposed by the Apple disaster is forcing systematic organizational evolution across the entire league. Teams are going to have to choose between empire building and empire control, because the middle ground approach just got eliminated by fan network pressure that can force executive retreat within hours. The successful organizations will adapt their structures to amplify star player empire potential through protective advocacy, fan relationship building, and independent revenue generation. The unsuccessful organizations will keep trying to fit empires into corporate control frameworks until their star players demand trades or their fan bases abandon them. The Clark Empire model is about to be replicated across the WNBA because it's proven more effective at generating loyalty, revenue, and influence than traditional organizational control approaches. The competitive advantage for teams that embrace empire building will be massive. They'll generate deeper fan loyalty, higher revenue per fan, stronger player advocacy, and more sustainable success than teams that cling to institutional control models, but the transformation won't be optional. The Fever's Apple disaster proved that fan networks can pressure institutional change faster than corporate restructuring processes, and those networks are building coordination capabilities for league-wide empire advocacy. Every WNBA executive needs to understand what Kelly Krauskopf learned the hard way. In the age of empire builders, institutional authority that contradicts empire loyalty becomes institutional liability that fan networks can eliminate through coordinated pressure. The revolution is here, the empire has tasted victory, and traditional organizational control structures will never be the same. The only question is whether your team will choose to build empires or become the next case study in institutional identity crisis. If you want to stay ahead of these organizational transformations, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because I'll be tracking every development in this evolving power structure. The empire builders are already planning their next moves, and you're going to want to know which organizations will adapt versus which will become cautionary tales. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think the Fever will choose empire building or corporate control? And which WNBA team will have the next institutional identity crisis? Because after the Apple disaster, every organization with a star player is facing the same impossible choice. The empire has spoken, corporate control has retreated, and the future belongs to organizations brave enough to build around their visionaries, instead of trying to control them. Welcome to the new era of empire building, and may your organization choose wisely before the fans choose for you.